Be me. Name is Wesley. 36 years old. Senior software engineer at a mid-sized tech company. Been here 8 years. Started as a junior developer. Worked my way up to technical lead through countless late nights. Company has about 60 employees. Development team is 18 people. I've trained probably half the current team at some point. Love mentoring. Love sharing knowledge. Nothing better than watching a junior dev have that light bulb moment. When something finally clicks. That's what makes this job meaningful. Team is a good mix, 12 men and 6 women. Never thought about the ratio, honestly. We just worked together, helped each other, built good software. No drama, no politics, just collaboration. Then we got a new manager. Her name was Sarah Hendricks, 38. Came from a bigger tech company in Seattle. Impressive resume, lots of management experience. Our old manager retired. Sarah was hired to modernize the team. First week she observed, sat in meetings, took notes. Seemed nice enough, asked good questions. Said she wanted to understand our culture before making changes. I thought that was smart. Learn first, act second. Second week, she started one-on-ones with everyone. My turn came on Thursday afternoon. She asked about my role, my experience, my working style. I explained that I do a lot of mentoring. Junior devs come to me with questions constantly. I like teaching, helps the team grow. She nodded and asked how I approached those conversations. I said I try to explain concepts thoroughly. Make sure they understand the why, not just the what. She wrote something down and said interesting. Asked if I ever considered whether people wanted explanations. Or if I just assumed they needed them. I said usually they come to me asking for help. So, yeah, they want explanations. She nodded again, but looked skeptical. Weird conversation, but I didn't think much of it. Third week, Sarah called a team meeting. Said she'd completed her assessment. Had some observations about our communication culture. I expected feedback about documentation or meeting efficiency. Standard manager stuff. Instead, she put up a slide titled Creating Equitable Communication. My stomach tightened. She started talking about power dynamics in technical teams. How knowledge can be used to assert dominance. How explaining things to people who didn't ask can be condescending. How this particularly affects women in male-dominated fields. Then she introduced the new policy. Effective immediately. Mansplaining was prohibited. I looked around the room. The men all had the same confused expression. A few of the women looked uncomfortable too. Someone asked what exactly counted as mansplaining. Sarah said explaining something to someone who didn't ask. Or explaining something to someone who already knows it. Or explaining something in a condescending tone. Or assuming someone needs explanation based on their gender. The definition was incredibly vague. Another guy asked how we'd know if someone already knew something. Sarah said we should ask before explaining. Get explicit consent to share knowledge. I raised my hand, asked what happens if someone asks a question in a meeting, and I answer it. Is that mansplaining? Sarah said it depends on the context. If a woman asked and a man answers extensively, that could be perceived as mansplaining. Better to let women answer questions from other women. And only contribute if specifically asked. I said that seems like it would slow down communication. She said it would create more equitable communication, which was more important than speed. Meeting ended with everyone looking shell-shocked. Guys clustered in small groups talking quietly. I found my buddy Trevor in the break room. He looked as confused as I felt. Asked if I understood what just happened. I said I think we just got told to stop talking. He said that's what it sounded like to him too. We grabbed coffee with 2 other senior devs, Marcus and Keith. All of us had been here 5+ years. All of us did significant mentoring and knowledge sharing. Keith asked how we're supposed to do our jobs now. Half of what I do is answer questions. Marcus said he had 3 junior devs on his project. They asked him stuff constantly. Was he supposed to just not answer? Trevor pointed out the policy, said mansplaining was explaining to someone who didn't ask, but also explaining in a condescending tone. Tone is subjective. Anyone could claim anything was condescending. I realized the problem. The policy was so vague that anything could be mansplaining. Any explanation, any answer, any help. If a woman felt it was condescending, it was a violation. No objective standard, just subjective perception. One person's helpful explanation is another person's mansplaining. How do you navigate that? You don't. You just stop explaining anything. That's the only safe option. I said it out loud. The only way to comply perfectly is to stop sharing knowledge entirely. If we never explain anything, we can never be accused of mansplaining. The guys nodded slowly. Trevor said, "That's insane though. The work won't get done." Marcus said, "Maybe that's the point." When everything falls apart, Sarah will see the policy was stupid. Keith said, "Malicious compliance." We all knew what that meant. Follow the rules exactly as written. Let the consequences speak for themselves. Word spread through the male developers. Not a formal plan, just a shared understanding. If explaining things was risky, we'd stop explaining things. Completely. First week of the policy. Monday morning's stand-up meeting. Junior dev named Amy asked a question about the API integration. She was stuck on authentication flow. Normally, I'd walk her through it. Explain the token system. Show her the documentation. Instead, I sat silently. Sarah looked at me expectantly. I stared at my coffee. Sarah asked if anyone had input. The men stayed silent. Finally, Lisa, one of the senior women, spoke up. She gave a partial answer, but didn't know the full system. I'd built that system 3 years ago. Knew it inside and out. Could have solved Amy's problem in 2 minutes. Instead, the meeting ended with the question unanswered. Amy looked frustrated. Lisa looked confused about why I hadn't helped. I felt guilty, but also trapped. If I'd explained, I might be mansplaining. Amy hadn't specifically asked me personally. Better to stay silent. Same pattern repeated throughout the week. Questions asked, men stayed quiet. Women tried to help but often didn't have the specific knowledge. A lot of our institutional knowledge lived in the senior men. We'd built most of the systems. We knew where the bodies were buried. Without us sharing, problems took longer to solve. Sometimes they didn't get solved at all. Week 2, and productivity was visibly dropping. Bugs that should take an hour to fix took a day. Because junior devs couldn't get help from senior devs. Features that should take a day took a week. Because nobody was explaining architectural decisions. Code review became useless. Normally, I'd leave detailed comments explaining improvements. Now I just clicked approve. Didn't want to be accused of mansplaining through written feedback. Trevor told me he had a junior dev ask him directly for help. Specifically asked him, used his name. He helped her but kept it minimal. Just answered the literal question, no context. She asked follow-up questions. He said he had to get back to work. Couldn't risk extended explanations. She looked hurt and confused. Probably thought he didn't like her. Reality was he was just scared of the policy. Sarah started noticing the slowdown. Called a meeting to discuss productivity concerns. Asked why sprint velocity had dropped 40%. Nobody answered. She asked the senior developers specifically. We all gave vague responses. Technical challenges, unexpected complexity. She pushed harder. Asked if the new communication policy was affecting anything. I stayed silent. Marcus said carefully, "We're being very mindful of our communication, making sure not to explain things unnecessarily, as the policy requires." Sarah frowned. Said the policy wasn't meant to stop communication, just to stop condescending communication. Keith asked how we determine what's condescending. Sarah said it's about tone and context. Keith asked who decides if tone is condescending. Sarah said the person receiving the communication. Keith nodded and said so anyone can claim anything is condescending and will be in violation. Sarah hesitated. Said people should use good judgment. Trevor asked whose good judgment, ours or theirs, because those might be different. Sarah didn't have a good answer. Said we were being deliberately difficult. The policy was straightforward. Just don't be condescending. Marcus said, we're not being condescending. We're not being anything. We've stopped explaining things entirely. That's the only way to guarantee compliance. Sarah looked shocked. Said that wasn't the intent. I finally spoke. Said intent doesn't matter. Impact does. That's what you told us. The impact of your policy is that men stopped sharing knowledge. Because any knowledge sharing could be interpreted as mansplaining. The only safe option is silence. So we're silent. Sarah dismissed the meeting looking troubled. But didn't change the policy. Maybe thought we'd give up and go back to normal. We didn't. Month 2, and things were falling apart. Major project deadline missed by 2 weeks. Client was furious. We almost lost the account. The problem was a database architecture issue. I knew exactly how to fix it. Had designed similar systems before. But the developer assigned to it was a woman named Jennifer. If I jumped in to explain the solution, that could be mansplaining. She hadn't asked me specifically. I stayed quiet while she struggled. Eventually, Lisa figured out part of the solution. Together they got it working, but it took 10 days. I could have solved it in 1. Jennifer came to me afterward. Looked exhausted and frustrated. Asked why I hadn't helped. Said she knew I had experience with this stuff. I said I didn't want to mansplain. She stared at me. Said she would have appreciated the help. I said I understand, but I couldn't risk it. The policy says explaining to someone who didn't specifically ask is mansplaining. You didn't specifically ask me. So I stayed out of it. She asked if I was serious. I said completely serious. The policy is vague enough that anything could be a violation. I'm protecting myself. She looked like she wanted to argue. But she also looked like she understood. The policy had created an impossible situation. Help and risk punishment. Or don't help and watch people struggle. We chose not helping. Week later, the women on the team asked for a meeting with Sarah. Without the men present. I heard about it afterward from Lisa. She said they complained about the policy. Said the male developers had completely withdrawn. Wouldn't answer questions. Wouldn't help with problems. Wouldn't share knowledge even when desperately needed. Lisa told Sarah this wasn't what they wanted. They wanted respectful communication, not silence. The policy was hurting them more than helping. They felt abandoned by colleagues who used to support them. Sarah was defensive. Said the men were being childish. Deliberately sabotaging to make her look bad. Lisa said maybe, but the result was the same. Women on the team were drowning. Because the men who knew things wouldn't share anymore. Whatever the intent, the impact was disaster. Sarah promised to address it. Called another team meeting that Friday. Started by acknowledging that communication had broken down. Said the mansplaining policy needed clarification. Men were not expected to stop all knowledge sharing. Just to be respectful and not condescending. Marcus raised his hand. Asked again how we determine what's condescending. Sarah sighed. Said use common sense. Trevor asked if common sense was a defense if someone filed a complaint. Could we say we used common sense and be cleared? Sarah admitted she wasn't sure. HR would evaluate complaints case by case. Keith said so we have no clear standard. Just subjective interpretation after the fact. Our careers could be damaged by anyone's perception, even if we thought we were being helpful. Sarah didn't have an answer. The meeting ended without resolution. Policy technically still in place. But nobody knew how to follow it safely. So men continued to stay silent. Month 3, upper management got involved. VP of Engineering noticed the productivity collapse. Multiple missed deadlines, client complaints, quality issues. Called a meeting with Sarah to understand what was happening. I wasn't there but heard about it from multiple sources. VP asked why the development team's output had dropped 50%. Sarah blamed technical challenges and team dynamics. VP asked what changed 3 months ago. Sarah admitted she'd implemented new communication guidelines. VP asked what guidelines. Sarah explained the mansplaining policy. VP was silent for a long moment. then asked if she understood what she'd done. She told half her team they couldn't share knowledge without clear guidelines for what was acceptable. Of course, they stopped sharing entirely. That was the predictable, rational response. Sarah defended the policy's intent. VP said intent didn't matter. Results did. Results were 50% productivity drop, multiple missed deadlines, near loss of major client, team morale at rock bottom, all traceable to one policy that made men afraid to speak. VP suspended the policy immediately, pending formal review, sent company-wide email clarifying expectations. All employees expected to share knowledge freely. Respectful communication required from everyone. No gendered policies on who can explain what to whom. I read that email 3 times. Relief washed over me. The nightmare was ending. Next Monday morning stand-up. Amy asked a question about the API integration. Same question from 3 months ago. That she'd eventually solved herself the hard way. This time I answered immediately. Walked her through the token system. Explained the authentication flow. Showed her documentation and examples. She thanked me and said she wished I'd helped sooner. I said me too. Meeting took 15 minutes instead of 45. Because information flowed freely. That's how it should work. Following weeks were like thawing after freeze. Senior devs started helping again. Junior devs started asking again. Problems got solved in hours instead of days. Productivity climbed back toward normal. The women on the team seemed relieved too. Lisa told me privately she never wanted that policy. Never felt mansplained to by our team. Sarah had imposed a solution to a problem that didn't exist. And created a real problem in the process. Sarah was quietly moved to a different role. Not fired, but no longer managing the dev team. New manager was a guy named Robert. Old school, focused on results. His communication policy was simple. Be respectful, be helpful, get work done. Just basic professionalism. 6 months later team was fully recovered. Productivity actually higher than before Sarah arrived. Because we'd all been reminded how important collaboration was. The silent period showed us what we'd lose without it. Made us appreciate knowledge sharing more. I got promoted to principal engineer. Role was specifically about mentoring and knowledge transfer. Exact opposite of what Sarah's policy had implied was wrong. The company recognized that teaching was valuable, not something to restrict or fear. Year later, I was training a new junior developer. Young woman named Rachel, fresh out of college. Smart but inexperienced, needed guidance. I explained everything thoroughly. Architecture decisions, coding patterns, debugging approaches. She asked tons of questions. I answered all of them. No hesitation, no fear. She said once that she appreciated how I explained things. Never made her feel stupid for not knowing. I said that's my job. Helping people learn isn't condescension. It's respect. Assuming someone can't handle information is condescension. Sharing knowledge is the opposite. It's saying I believe you can understand this. And I want to help you get there. She nodded and said her last workplace had weird rules about this. Men weren't supposed to explain things to women. Everyone walked on eggshells. Nothing got done efficiently. I said we tried that once. Lasted 3 months before imploding. She asked what happened. I told her the whole story. The policy, the silence, the collapse, the recovery. She shook her head. Said, why do people think restricting communication helps anyone? I said because they focus on the worst examples. See one guy being condescending. Conclude all male explanation is problematic. But the solution to bad communication isn't no communication. It's better communication. You don't fix a leak by turning off all the water. You fix the leak. She laughed and said that was a good analogy. I said feel free to use it. That's not mansplaining. That's just sharing. Anyway, that's the story of how our manager banned mansplaining. With a vague policy that could mean anything. Made men afraid to share any knowledge at all. Watched productivity crash 50% in 3 months. Missed deadlines, lost clients, destroyed morale. All because she wanted to solve a problem that didn't really exist on our team. The men weren't being condescending. They were being helpful. And when being helpful became risky, they stopped being helpful, which hurt everyone, including the women the policy was meant to protect. Turns out you can't improve communication by banning it. Can't build equity by creating fear. Can't help women by silencing men. You just create a worse environment for everyone. The policy assumed men explaining things was inherently bad. But explaining things is how knowledge transfers, how teams grow, how skills develop. Remove that, and everything slows down. Everyone suffers. Real respect isn't about who's allowed to speak. It's about how we speak to each other. Regardless of gender, treat people as individuals, not categories. Help when you can, ask when you need. That's not complicated. But somehow we keep making it complicated, with policies that sound good, but work terribly. Intentions don't matter. Results matter. And Sarah's results were catastrophic.